Hello, this is a short introduction to what is HR analytics, and in particular the definition of what is HR analytics in the context of critical people analytics, that is this module that you are going to take. People analytics is basically analyzing detailed data in order to solve business problems. This is the main philosophy. The main philosophy behind people analytics is that you will be able to, by making inferences based on effective analysis of concrete data. By concrete data, it means what we call evidence-based data, right? Most in a great number of occasions, this data is quantitatively, right? It's a sort of based on statistical information. Yeah. And with the intention to produce a huge and a vast and complex analysis that will help the managers to make decisions. Yeah. So the idea is that behind any sort of decision in terms of people, the way of scrutinizing the potential interventions in respect to the people is based on data, not on common sense, let's say, or discussions that are out of the data. Yeah. Obviously, you know, by data we were going to discuss, we are talking about huge amounts of data in generally speaking, huge and diverse as well. Yeah. The idea is that by analyzing this data, you will be able to, for example, make decisions at a very strategic and top level of the organization. Who is responsible for? Why is important? It's because of the capacity of making analysis and making decisions, right? In particular, what is important is that the decisions are made on a different kind of spectrum, and what usually is called interorganizational spectrum. So you can, by critical people analytics, by analyzing critically the data produced by the people in the organization, you will be able to make, for example, connections between the financial impact of making these decisions with the pure human aspects of the organization. So, and this is why it's quite important to make it properly and making it in consideration to different kind of aspects. The idea that, you know, by affecting the practices of the policies of human resources, is it possible, based on analysis of data, it will be possible to define and change initiatives on the whole organization, right? And even in particular on the future strategy of the organization. The main idea is that the large organizations usually have this they prefer, or they have a decentralized approach of people and analysts. Sometimes, you know, it's possible to find an organization that there are more small centers that they are dedicated to specific organizations, so there's specific issues, and they collect data and they analyze the data based on this particular issue that they try to address. For example, units specialized in turnover, usually specialized in retention, usually units for example, specialized in expatriation of international assignments, and they collect only data from these sections. Other large organizations, they are more interactive, they're more co-participative. Usually they take a hybrid approach. There are, for example, multinational corporations that they produce some sort of nucleus of way of practicing HR analytics by mixing decisions. So, for example, the financial impact of organizing expatriation, and they collect data from this for a multivariety of units. Yeah. The what is very, very important in critical people analytics is the way of managing the data. So this data is quite sophisticated and has to be managed properly. So usually the organizations who have a policy of people analytics, they have someone who kept the criteria, and then they manage professionally the way of not only producing the data, what's called data gathering, but also the way of analyzing the data. What about the uses of people analytics? So any kind of applications of people analytics. Let me show you a couple of examples. So, for example, one of the typical example is, like, for example, enhancing the employee morale, right? Organizations that can that try to collect data, to gather data in order to improve the morale of the people, right? This is quite important, yeah. And usually this is made by surveys, right? By repetitive surveys, trying to analyze, one of the most important and very, very well known is what is called the best place to work, for example, right? That is a good place to work. That is a very interesting way of analyzing if a place is interesting for the people to work. And it's not only about the compensation, the money, but it's also about the way that you feel when working in this place. Other ones, for example, could be like the improving retention, right? So, for example, in particular, organizations that are suffering of a huge turnover, they try to define, by analyzing the data, what is needed in order to produce retention, to reduce the turnover, right? Obviously, something that is much more interesting or much more, let's say, crucial nowadays is the what is called the ethical concerns, right? Critical people analytics, if it's done properly, could also help to address any sort of concerns regarding the ethical implications of working and the organizational practice, in particular the equality, diversity, and inclusion, like what's called EDI, and the corporate social responsibility. Yeah. So. In particular, it's about identifying and quantifying human drivers of business outcomes. Yeah, I would say that it's also qualifying the business outcomes. So the idea is, for example, some question is just examples, right? Which candidate will perform best, and which kind of data we need to collect in order to analyze which candidate perform best, or performance management. What are the three most important drivers of sales performance? You see. This is always try to identify the way of collecting data in order to analyze this particular aspect of a human way of organizing. Yeah, and obviously, like, for example, what about learning and development? So which kind of learning and training is better for our project or for our organization? So you see, it's always a question in order to make a decision, and by asking the question, this trigger what is called the data that is needed in order to produce. Sometimes the data could be pure quantitatively, sometimes could be qualitative, and sometimes could be a mix of both, right? Or, for example, turnover. What is needed to be done in order to retain staff? Yeah, which kind of data we need to take, right? So, for example, there are studies who say that the best data in order to analyze turnover is not data that comes exclusively from employees who are currently working in the organization, but the employees who left the organization, right? Interview them or distribute among them a survey after they leave the place. Yeah, this is quite interesting, right? So every HR analytics journey begins with a question of a particular business issue. You see, it's always a question that you want to answer or you want to analyze. And this is why, it's quite important, right? And this is why, for example, in this module, to address the question, to be able to analyze and define the question for your final essay will be absolutely crucial, right? So you will have to be able to say, this is the question and this is the data that is needed to be gathered and to be analyzed in order to respond to this question. Yeah. The clear statement will give you, it will be the outcome, so what we want to achieve, the decision or the reflection about which kind of data you need to produce in order, and the action that has to be taken in order to use this data, or to use the inferences that you will produce by analyzing this data. Yeah. So, for example, some sort of problems that you can imagine. Right? So the question came from a problem that you define. Yeah. So the first issue is that to define a problem, to make what is called the diagnosis of a problem. Yeah. So, for example, we hire people, and within a year, many of them leave. Why this is happening? Why the people are leaving this place after a year? No, this could be one of the problem that you could have. And this will detonate immediately a question, right? That will be, which kind of data we need to produce, which kind of inferences and data we need to produce in order to analyze retention. Yeah? Or, for example, we hire more women than men, but we still have a majority of males in our senior rank. Why? Yeah. So why this is happening? Yeah. And here you have a list of problems. Yeah. Top-down requests, operational issues, could be strategic goals, could be stories, benchmarks. Yeah. And this is the way of analyzing and making what's called an inquiry map and the decision of using critical analytics. Yeah. The data analytics include, probably you see, is critical here. The way of is not only what's called data gathering, that is collecting the data, but then the way of interrogating the data, that is the analysis, right? So remember, the first stage is what we call the diagnosis. Yeah. So what is happening? What is the problem? And defining the problem and the question. The second is gathering the data. Defining what is called usually the corpus of data that you're going to use. And the next step is analyzing the data. Yeah. The data by itself, they will not answer any question. You have the data. You have produced the data. Now it's time to analyze the data. And this is quite important. So could include any kind of steps, yeah, human and machine working together, like semi-automatic way of analyzing the data, discovering, making much more interpretation of the data. Could be more what's called narrative analysis, could be much quantitative analysis, could be statistical analysis, yeah. And the final intention is to try to find trends, to uncover any sort of things that are invisible in the surface, and you want to discover behind the lines. Try to predict, try to make triggers, try to imagine future scenarios that you will not discover by pure observing or pure reflecting of what is happening, but need to be discovered by scrutinizing in depth, very detailed data, yeah, and finally to make the decisions, yeah. So, for example, what to look for? You can look for different kind of information, right? Any kind of sources of organizational information. For example, skills and quantifications, 360 interviews, that usually they are produced in the organizations every year. Measures that try to define competencies, any sort of statistical information or qualitative information, even about development, learning and development that the working force has attended, engagement, culture, could be like obviously compensation, right? So the salaries, any sort of ethical proceedings, right? So any sort of try to detect or make a diagnosis of any sort of ethical conflicts, for example, right? Obviously, any sort of data that could illuminate about the equality, diversity, and inclusion practices in the organization. Yeah. And where to find this? And this is quite important, you know, because in most cases, the data is already produced. What critical people analytics does is basically analyzing the data from you. So in a good number of cases, organizations do not produce original data. Yeah. So, for example, human resources databases, right, that can describe any sort of employees details, personal data, promotion data, the story of the employee, and you will have data like obviously what's called the demographic data, age, gender, education, the level, the salary, the roles, right? The attitude that's right. For example, the 360 interviews that from annual reviews, yeah, that again illuminate, like, for example, job satisfaction, culture, perception of justice, injustice, levels of, for example, of stress in the working force, and then more business related, right? They usually are these in terms of for example, the level of sales, the level of production, these units of proficiency of using people in the right place and in the right moment, right? That could usually illuminate, like, for example, the average monthly sales, or it could be defined by this sort of data from more customer-oriented data. Yeah. This module will also work on helping you to reflect on how to select and use the data. Yeah, selecting of data is quite important. Yeah, because again, remember, you will need to define the data that you need to use in order to in relation to the problem and the question that you want to discuss. You want to try to tackle, right? And we will work extensively on defining about the content, the needs of working on the data, what you want to do after the analysis, and how is the best way of using the time and the resources to do a profound critical analysis. So means the resources. What do you need in order to produce a detailed critical people analytic projects. Yeah, remember that we are talking about huge amount of data, time consuming sometime. Yeah, so you have to be very well prepared to make an evaluation of the needs to produce this data. This is quite interesting. You always, in the organizations are sources of what is called hard data and soft data. Yeah, hard data and are made usually by data that comes from immediate statistical produce of the organizational outcomes. For example, like financial cost, sales cost, customer bases, position in the market. Now, all of the statistical information that is almost automatically produced by the organizational itself, right? Business reports, everything that comes by the function of the organization. Soft data is much more like data that is produced by the internal organization, not necessarily the external practice of the organization. Like, for example, loyalty, complaints, feedback, right? For example, social media, right? How is what's called the social media reputation of the organizations, right? Or, for example, burnout rate or retention rate, or the programs, the learning programs that the people has completed, right? So the interesting things about critical people analytics is when the soft data and hard data, the analysis of these two data are combined, yeah, and illuminates a new way of thinking about the problem. Yeah. Let me give you, just to finish, a couple of examples, right? So imagine that you say, well, I want to make a determination of the combination between values, competencies and skills. What is the relation? You see, one looks too much more what's called the analysis of hard data, and the other one a little bit more about the analysis of soft data. You see, or for example, labor market and internal needs, and this is an issue about recruitment, right? So what you need in terms of the people of the demand of people working in the place, what are your needs, and what the market is offering. Yeah. So this could include, for example, an analysis of the number of students who are graduating from the university, graduates. Yeah, in order to analyze, the market of graduates is satisfying my demands as a company. Yeah, for example, as an organization. Yeah, or for example, identify behaviors or remuneration or skills and attributes, or make a determination of any sort of, for example, the promotions, the promotions in the place. Do we have in this place a concrete promotion strategy, so the people knows about which are the best organizational practices in order to be promoted. Yeah. And here it's tricky, right? Because it's not only just to say, well, you have, it's not always like the recipe to be promoted as this one, because this, again, organizations are very, very, flexible. They are permanently changing. So, for example, network analysis, what is called networking analysis, could be a very good, interesting sources of data in order to analyze promotions. Anyway, so thank you very much, and it will be great to work together in this module. And hope to work to have a very, very interesting way of working together and imagine critical people analytics projects. Take care.